Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, which is a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Eddie Boon. I'm here in East London, where I'm based, and I'm serving the Thames North Synod of the United Reformed Church as discipleship enabler. And so it's a real joy and privilege to be able to share in these conversations for this season of the podcast. And we do hope that they'll be useful to you in your preaching ministry. So I'd like to introduce today's guest, who is Dave Mann. Welcome, Dave.
Great to be here.
This is a special joy to me as Dave has become a good friend to me personally over the last 6 years. Dave has been involved in urban mission since the 80s in Tower Hamlets and has been pastoring and church planting in London since 1996. He has extensive experience of setting up and running charities and schools and has taught and spoken at churches, conferences and colleges around the world on mission, leadership and community organisation. Dave has worked across denominations in his role with Seedbeds and as one of the founders of Red Letter Christians UK. Dave and his wife Sally are two of five ministers at Bonny Downs Baptist Church in East Ham, all sharing one stipend. And next year, Dave and Sally will move into the new Bonny Downs Abbey to share life and a rhythm of prayer with 8 friends moving on from homelessness. In his spare time, Dave is a pioneer of walking football for the over 50s and chair of Newham Cricket Club. So it's great to have you with us, Dave. And today's JPIT member joining us is Hannah Fremont Brown, former JPIT officer and currently the Methodist Justice Seeking Church officer. So welcome to you, Hannah, and we look forward to a fruitful conversation today. Just to set a few bits of context in a moment, but before that, perhaps I could ask Dave, especially, how do you see the place of politics and how life is structured and organised? You're very much a community activist, I know. How do you see that relating to the ministry of preaching in today's church?
Well, in 2019, we set up Red Letter Christians UK, and the strapline for that is living for Jesus and justice. And our aim is to put politics very much at the centre of the pulpit, because Jesus was intensely political. Politics really is about who gets what, when, and how. And that affects not just civic society, but it affects our communities and our family life as well. So to deny that politics should be central to our pulpit preaching, for me, is just nonsensical.
Mm-hmm. I know, obviously, as part of the JPIT team, it's something that you long for. And in the Methodist Church, um, either of you, are there situations recently where you've felt that justice themes have been well handled in sermons or messages that you've heard?
Yeah, lately my church, I go to a Methodist church in London, and we've been celebrating Pride as part of our worship. And I think for us that had, well, that theme of Pride for the LGBTQIA plus community always has a political edge to it because of where our society is at. But particularly this year, when rights for trans people in our communities have been so threatened and affected, that really felt like it had a political edge to make sure we were standing in solidarity with our siblings through worship, not just outside of it, was really important to us.
Thank you, Hannah. And just to set, before we start to take a look at some of the passages, which we have for Sunday, the 9th of August, here's a few things that currently, things move quickly. Time of recording, here's some of the things that are going on in the world today. Our new Prime Minister tells the BBC that the NHS might collapse without the reform of social care. There's been a race to contain wildfires across Europe, especially in France, in Spain, and Italy. And there was a wildfire in Scotland, I believe. And the oil price continues to fluctuate. It went down as there were pauses in the war in Iran, but it's really taking that one day by day, isn't it? Ed Miliband, the new Foreign Secretary, indicates that development and climate will be at the heart of UK foreign policy. There's been continued fallout over Donald Trump's attacks on election integrity, and more recently, attacks on award-winning journalists and media outlets. And of course, the Clacton by-election will take place next week on the 13th of August, a record-breaking 34 candidates, without Labour, Conservative, Lib Dems, Green or Restore, with Count Binface, who's all known as Jonathan Harvey, being the main challenger to Nigel Farage. There's a couple of awareness days which you might find influence your preaching for that Sunday. The UN International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, which happens every year to protect rights, raise awareness and celebrate cultures. That happens on the 9th of August. And there's the UN International Youth Day on the 12th of August, celebrating young people, raising awareness of global youth challenges and highlighting youth contributions to sustainable development. There's much in the news that will affect our discipleship and our worship and our preaching. So let me introduce the lectionary readings for Sunday the 9th of August, and then we'll start to dig into them. They are, and the verses you'll find in the bio for this podcast, but the chapters are Genesis 37, Psalm 105, Romans 10, Matthew 14, and there's two alternative readings, which are 1 Kings 19 and Psalm 85. So we're going to have a conversation now around those texts. And in true Dave Mann iconoclastic style, Dave, you've already said to me that the starting point for you, as you've looked at these passages, is one of the alternative readings. That is Psalm 84. So tell us what drew you to that passage from all those that were listed. What's on your heart?
Yeah, well, probably it was just awkwardness. It was the last one of the alternative readings rather than any of the mainstream ones. But it was Psalm 85, and the truth is that I think it sums up very much the God's heartbeat of justice from all of the other ones. But it's also the only one that mentions love, which is quite unusual for a whole lectionary load of readings. And for me, the one most important word in the whole Bible is love, probably even more than God, because 1 John says God is love. And I love the Message's version of 1 Corinthians 13:13, where it says love extravagantly. And for me, what is God's heartbeat for us as individuals is to receive God's extravagant love in order to share God's extravagant love. And we do that on a personal level for our churches, more important, I think, for our communities. And that's what it talks about, this psalm. It says, I listen carefully to what God the Lord is saying. And that listening comes out really clearly in the story of Jesus stilling the storm, Peter walking on the water, and the reading from Kings, Elijah listening to the still small voice. So we need to listen. We need to hear what God is saying to us. And it says, for he speaks peace to his faithful people. And Eddie, you just read out a whole load of current news items that are at the opposite of peace, isn't it? It's about war and warmongers. And for me, my heart cries out that the church was so silent and complicit in so much of that war mongering and war making. So we need to listen. We need to hear God speaking peace to his faithful people, but let them not return to their foolish ways. And there's that old saying, isn't there? History repeats itself, has to, because no one listens the first time. And I just think so much of the issues that are raised in these readings we're experiencing exactly the same things today, and it's because we don't listen properly. And then here is this way we're doing it. Surely God's salvation is near to those who fear God, so that our land will be filled with God's glory. And God's salvation, God's healing, God's shalom is near to every single one of us. And why is that? It isn't so that we can have happy lives and go to heaven when we die. It isn't even so that we can plant loads of really good, thriving churches. The church is a means to an end. What is that end? It is that our land will be filled with God's glory. Our world will be filled with God's glory. Peace will triumph over war, and justice will triumph over oppression. So for me, those verses, and then it goes on, and as I said, the next little bit says, unfailing love and truth have met together. And we see that where? In the death and the resurrection of Jesus, and in the transformation that God's Spirit can bring us to us as individuals and as a church. So where do all of these readings lead? For me, is those verses there about God's peace, God's justice, God's love, bringing that hope.
Yeah, Hannah, is there anything that Dave shared there that speaks to you in terms of peace and love and justice and faithfulness? I'm sure there is.
Mm. Yeah, I think one of the things that really struck me when I read this is the certainty of it, the very sure voice and the very confident voice of the psalmist here. Let me hear what God will speak. This is not a crying out in uncertainty. It is that certainty that God meets us with love and with justice. And also seeing that um, in that sense that we get from the middle of the psalm, a faithfulness will spring up from the ground and righteousness will look down from the sky. I think in that imagery for me, there's something about being almost encapsulated in God's love and justice that actually, in the midst of all the turmoil that we might feel around us, it might feel like that is all the context, that's the sea that we swim in. But actually, the psalm tells us here that God's steadfast love and steadfast faithfulness is ever present. It's there. And when we look for it, we will find it in the things below us and the things around us. If that's not inspiring me to kind of step out and trust that God's justice will be alongside me as I do, that should be such a resource for us.
Yeah, yeah, that's so true. And I guess the church, yeah, Dave, gone.
Yeah, I was going to say, if people choose to preach on this psalm from the lectionary, I suggest singing "Here Is Love, Vast as the Ocean," and I love the second verse. It says, "On the Mount of Crucifixion, fountains open deep and wide. Through the floodgates of God's mercy flowed a vast and gracious tide. Grace and love, like mighty rivers, poured incessant from above. And God's heaven's peace and perfect justice kissed the guilty world in love." And maybe that last line was inspired by that righteousness and peace of kissed. And
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, so sing "Here Is Love" alongside that psalm.
verse 10, yeah. And that whole concept of love and faithfulness, um, I guess dancing together is another way that you'd think might want to think about it. And that can be a struggle, I think, for Christians and for churches because, what does it mean to express faithfulness and love or love and truth? How do we say it? And at times in today's world, they can seem to be in conflict, and some people who claim to have the truth seem to be without love. And what does it mean to be truthful as Christians? And this listening, I guess, Dave is a sort of activist at heart, community organizer. On the one hand, that verse might cause some to people to sort of take on like a quietist hermit like existence where we're just listening to God. But the promise here is not turning to folly, and that's where it clearly relates to practical action as Christians. Yeah, it's really good. God is near.
Now, I think we need to keep listening to the truth from Jesus in order to keep us really positive and assured. And I like Hannah, you picked this is certain. We know the end of the story. Jesus is going to come back and make all things new, wipe every tear from our eyes. In the meantime, the what we see in the world is so far apart from that, and sadly, what we often see in the church is so far apart from that. Which is why we need to focus on Jesus, listen to Jesus, read the Bible through the red letters of Jesus, what Jesus taught, who Jesus was, in order for us to understand what are the things the Bible says we should be doing, but also what are the things the Bible is saying we should not be doing, and where are the lessons that we can learn from other people that we don't have to repeat that folly of. And one of my great sayings is that it's good to learn from experience, but it's better to learn from other people's experience because it's much less painful. So let's listen and let's learn from Jesus so we don't repeat that folly. And so we are empowered, because two of these readings, the walking on the water, the disciples were exhausted, and it's a lesson really of listening to Jesus and putting our faith and our trust and getting him to renew our strength. Same with Elijah. He had this amazing triumph and affirmation against the prophets of Baal, and then runs away and wants to die. And I just love the beauty and the gentleness of the way God deals with him. Just says, "What are you doing here, Elijah? What are you doing?" And getting him back on an even keel before he can even start the conversation about why he's there and where he's going to go. And the truth is, when we are standing up against the powers of injustice and darkness in our world, it is really tiring, and we need to be doing it together. We need to be doing it in a focused way through our churches, but we need to be doing it deeply rooted in our own relationship with Jesus.
Yeah.
And as you said, Sally and I are going to move into our abbey. We're going to have a rhythm of prayer there. And so we want to be on the cutting edge of addressing issues of homelessness and division in the community. But we can't do that and sustain it unless we are being empowered by the resurrection power of Jesus through God's Spirit.
Yeah, that's it.
And I find it infinitely reassuring that, after this, there have been thousands of years of people who had the certainty of this psalm, right? That this psalm was written and predates so many stories we have of people not trusting and getting it wrong and failing to believe in the certainty that God is there. And we're going to do that too. And it's okay to feel like we hold both in our faith and in our lives, that we can keep coming back to the certainty that God is there in love and justice, and keep
Yeah,
getting it wrong. And both of
yeah,
those things can be held together.
yeah, definitely. And that for me really relates to the Matthew 14, Jesus walks on the water, because the introduction of that says that Jesus says to them, get into the boat and go ahead of him, and that can feel pretty scary for us as Christians when we feel like God is by our side, but also nudging us into uncertain territory. And Jesus goes to a mountainside to pray, and then this experience with the boat, and it's easy just because we think we know the character of Peter so well to you know just rereading this reminds you I wouldn't get out. I wouldn't get out of a boat into whatever depth of water it would be, because I grew up by the sea and I know how dangerous it is. So what is going on here when Jesus says, "Take courage, don't be afraid," about our fears about living for Jesus. And I guess this wonderful story about the Abbey, I'm sure as you've planned it and demolished a church building, there must have been all sorts of voices of fear and anxiety. And are we doing the right thing, or are we going ahead of Jesus in the wrong direction? Does that strike a chord?
Yeah, but actually, probably and just over a year ago, we'd been fundraising for 4 years, and we'd raised £3.25 million, which was our fundraising target for that. And we realised, going back to the market, that in that time the prices had gone up by £500,000, so we were £500,000 short. And the passage that came to mind at that stage really powerfully was the loaves and the fishes, so the one that just preceded this. And it was, the question was, well, don't look at the scarcity and the lack. What have you got? You know, what
Mm.
are your loaves and fishes? And when we took that seriously, God didn't just provide another 500,000, because actually when we went to put the contract out, it was another 500,000, a whole million. So God, after all of that hard work, in a year, God provided in miraculous ways a whole another £1 million, because we'd given God what we'd got.
Mm.
And so that was a really powerful lesson for me in allowing faith to overcome fear and doubt. And so that was the loaves and the fishes. And then we get that same lesson repeated exactly in this story immediately afterwards. And I love, again, the red letters of Jesus. Take courage, I'm here. And I hope that everybody in church on Sunday, the 9th of August, would hear those words to them. Take courage in whatever struggles you're going through, because
Mm.
Jesus is there with you. And
Mm.
then don't be afraid. Look, it might seem insurmountable issues, but actually, I've got it. And then he says, come. And so for everybody who's listening to any of these talks, actually, they are the key things. Jesus has got it, and Jesus is going to sort things out. Just put your trust in him, and follow in his footsteps.
Mm. Mm. It ends up, doesn't it? Truly, you are the Son of God, like a state, declaration, and they worship. And so, if any, there's a reminder there, I guess, in our preaching that sometimes people can end up thinking, well, nobody worshipped Jesus, the disciples didn't worship. Here's a example where their very lives depended on trusting Jesus, and therefore they worshipped him and declared that he is the Son of God, which to me is at the core of any Christian preaching.
Yeah.
And there's something for me in this. In the moment as Peter steps out of the boat, doubts, and begins to sink and says, Lord, save me. In my translation that I'm reading here, it says, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, You have little faith, why did you doubt? Jesus doesn't say, Why are you doubting? Look at you sinking. Jesus reaches out, catches him, and then says, Why did you doubt? I think there's something about that reassurance to say Jesus cares infinitely about our physical
Yeah,
needs and situation and responding to that, but also reaching out again in that love first and
yeah.
then helping us to grow. I think I often struggle in my faith with the belief that some Christians hold that God puts us through challenges as a learning opportunity. We
Mm.
struggle, so that God can teach us something. Um, but actually, here's something that says Jesus meets us in our challenge, sits with us in it, is there in it, and helps us to learn from it, not in a way of punishing, but in love first.
Yeah, that's really helpful to help us avoid. Yeah, Dave.
Well, and that's so important. Why we need to read the other readings in the light of Jesus's red letters and Jesus' example, because the psalm talking about Joseph, Psalm 105, actually says that God tested Joseph's character in Egypt in a way that God orchestrated all those terrible things that happened to Joseph, in order to use him and his troubles to bring salvation and help for his people. Now, God overrules in those things, but it's not God who's behind that
No,
wickedness and injustice.
yeah.
And I mean, there is something else I want to say about that Joseph story, Eddie. Is this the right time?
Yeah, go ahead. Just before you do, just before I forget, Hannah, that was spot on in terms of seeing God with us, um, and not necessarily testing us or provide or doing these things to us. I'm ongoing, quite a serious health condition, and God really came close and said, it's not a battle that you're fighting. It's not something you're trying to prove who I am by your winning a victory. Simply a sense that God's with you in a season, a different season of health challenges where God is with you. And what does it mean to live out your discipleship? Otherwise you set yourself up for such incredible failure or even folly, I think, as that passage reminded us, that we can set ourselves up and we end up looking stupid, and we end up discouraging Christians that we come into contact with by by narrowing down the view of God's mercy. So yeah, Genesis 37, Dave.
Well, it would be really easy to take this passage and to preach traditional sermon on the danger of pride, the danger of jealousy, how that leads to violence, and then perhaps the wisdom or otherwise of compromise instead of killing Joseph off, selling him into slavery. So you could take the easy option on all of those personal sort of things. I think then you could move it on politically. You could talk about the terrible injustice of trafficking, which is a really sad and powerful reality in our world. Um, but I think the loudest message of the story of Joseph is what Joseph did once he had his position of power in Egypt, in that he actually laid the foundations for the slavery of his whole people by allowing all of the assets, the land in Egypt, to be sucked up under the control of Pharaoh as one person, which ended up with his people becoming serfs and then slaves. And with really Pharaoh able to commit whatever injustices he was able to do. Now, that is exactly what's happening in our world economy now. The inequality, the inequity between people in countries like ours, but much more so in the two-thirds world, those that have been exploited economically by the few. And this inequality is starker and starker and will lead to more and more poverty, more and more anger, more and more violence. And I really encourage people to have a read of Brian McLaren's book. It's quite old now, called Everything Must Change, about how this growth and using up all of the world's resources leads to growing and growing inequality, which leads to more and more anger. You mentioned about the indigenous people and the young people, especially awareness at the moment. Now, they're the ones that have been really exploited. Our young people today have not got a hope of owning their own homes, having regular lifelong careers, really. There is this huge danger and volatility which causes fear and causes the increase in defence spending, the security thing. And at the root of it all, Brian McLaren says, is a spirituality issue. It's because actually we're either too scared or too compromised to be able to A, understand and hold on to the truth, and then B, to live it out. And I think what the passage we haven't talked about at all is Romans, and Romans is really tricky. And it's almost like the elephant in the room. But what is the overwhelming? I mean, you can argue all day about who's saved and who isn't saved, and what saves you. Is it who you were born as, or what you do, or what you believe? But the big issue is actually the test of your salvation, the test of your faith is how you live.
Yeah.
And that is the challenge for me. It's being really clear about what God wants for us, to see that beautiful, loving peace and justice, kissing the world in love. And then it's about giving our whole lives to working for justice, equity, and giving our loaves and fishes. So I the Joseph story, you could go for an easy, really option on just preaching personal behaviour, or you could say, well, actually, this is a wake-up call, and we need to be doing something about all of the world's assets being accumulated by so few and creating such danger economically, ecologically. These are really they're dangerous, volatile times. But as Hannah said at the start, we know what the end of the story is.
Yeah.
Our challenge is let's live it now.
But when you get to Romans 10, at the end of the day, it says, how beautiful are the feet. You know, people can hear the good news. And are we good news people? And that's what I heard you saying, Dave.
Yeah, I think, and this might be because I've, done enough school productions of Joseph to be interested in the small characters in the story. But one of the characters I was really interested in reading this passage again this time was Reuben. And this moment in the story where Reuben says, "Oh, don't kill him. Let's do something different with him anyway." And they end up throwing him in the pit. And I've been thinking since I read these last passages last week, when am I Reuben who says, I'll just try to change the narrative, but I don't really go far enough? When am I Reuben who says, I'll help a bit, but I'm not going to change the system?
Yeah.
I'll do something that saves you for now. But I'm not going to ask the questions that Dave was just asking that ask that just flip the narrative and that write a different story.
Yeah.
And I think there's a challenge for us in paying attention to them, and that some of those small moments here say actually our calling as followers of Jesus to be people who choose those moments to flip the narrative, to say there is a different story and to live and act in pursuit of that being the reality.
Yeah.
Um, so many of those moments in our own lives and in the biblical story where the path's not taken could show us something much, much more brilliant.
Yeah. Um, to be all in for Jesus and Jesus, the way of Jesus, not just to give people fish, but to teach them how to fish comes to mind, and how I guess many people in our churches today that will hear sermons and messages on that Sunday, where when prompted may feel a bit like they are Rubens, and that would be a fantastic thing to say in a sermon, wouldn't it? Hands up here, how many of you are Rubens? And they'll all look round puzzled, but it's so true what you said.
And it's fear, right? It's not often a conscious decision to say, "Oh, I'll only do a bit, I won't do a lot."
Oh yeah,
It's. I think this story for me, again, reading it this time, the narrative of fear driving decision making here, and in the gospel reading, had me reflecting so much on the divisions in our communities now, the anxiety and fear people have towards somebody who's different or other, or who's threatening the position that they have, because that's who Joseph was to his brothers, right? A threat to what they needed to survive and wanted for their own power. Um, where is fear driving our actions towards other people to say, actually, if I go further than that, I might lose something, and I'm not sure I'm ready to face up to that. I think calling out fear maybe we have within our own communities that stops us from fully uh, choosing to take actions that really change things up would be a really interesting approach to this passage.
yeah,
Amen, which takes us really beautifully back to the end of the psalm, isn't it? Where it's
yeah.
God says,
We,
perfect love casts out fear, isn't it? So it's,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and that's really fantastic. We've had a real sort of buffet banquet of texts, which you know aren't straightforward texts to interpret and to preach on, but together we've seen a few threads emerge, and some impulses to what we're about as preachers, I guess. And thank you to Dave and to Hannah for sharing in this really fascinating conversation. And I hope it does help the listeners in their preparation for preaching on that Sunday. And thank you for listening to this episode. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave us a review wherever you download your podcasts, and share the episode with your friends if that's possible. If there's any feedback about how this podcast may have helped you in your preaching ministry, please do get in touch. We'd love to hear from you. There's also online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. I feel really hopeful after what the two of you have shared, and not only in thinking about these Bible texts, but just seeing how they can take root in practical ways through the mission of the church and communities that we've heard today. Uh, could I ask you, is there just a quick takeaway, a thought that you'd like to leave us with, Hannah? Has anything really struck you from our conversation?
Yeah, I enjoyed Dave's reminder and challenge of what does it look like to read all of the passages back through the red letters of Jesus. We don't often do that to our Old Testament passages, but read them in the light of that good news. And I think in this week, it opens up some more angles than perhaps we would traditionally consider for the Old Testament readings,
Yeah.
and the Psalms. So, yeah, that'll definitely sit with me.
Yeah, thank you. And a bit depends, I guess, on whether preachers are working through one of the sort of themes or Bible books as a primary passage. But this is an example of it, of things just mixing together. Dave, what about you? What would you like to leave us with?
Well, that was a nice segue. Tony Campolo, who started Red Letter Christians in the States, would always say, get the website in. And it's Red Letter Christians .org.uk, I think, or something like that. And yeah, for me, it's going back to that verse 9, particularly in Psalm 85. Surely God's salvation is near to those who fear God, so our land will be filled with God's glory. Let's focus on how our lives can be part of that God's rule of love, seeing God's glory filling and transforming our land.
Thank you, Dave. And you're too shy to plug, but you've just recently published a prayer book, which perhaps relates to that listening to God. So, like blending prayer with Jesus and justice, and details can be found on your website. That's been really brilliant today. So, thank you, Hannah, and thank you, Dave, and bless you for all that you've shared with us today. Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bless.